I texted some of my Ukraine sources, and they say, actually, no, we don't want to see Israel hit any of these nuclear sites, because then potentially in the context of the global landscape that we're in, potentially then Putin no longer has that red line to cross and says, well, Israel is hitting nuclear sites, nuclear targets, so can I. And then these nuclear power plants in Ukraine become a target as well.
Let's talk first to Zach Anders there, freelance Middle East correspondent, joining us live from the Negev Desert. Hello and welcome back to the programme, Zach.
Hi, John.
Let me start then with the death. We now learn about this today, Zach, of the Hamas political leader. It looks like a big target struck, and it happened some days ago.
Yeah, the IDF says that this is several months old. I think the most surprising element here is that we didn't get any word of this through the Hamas channels, that senior leadership within their political echelon had been killed months ago. Again, this is news that's coming through the IDF, so that's really all we have at this point, that essentially the interim leader of Hamas's political wing was killed inside Gaza.
Yes, and on this other breaking development, that the Lebanese military are now, actively involved. They're not a mighty military force, but it is a moment to mark, isn't it?
And the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces here, they are supposed to, over the last few decades, play a pivotal role in southern Lebanon, preventing Hezbollah from controlling the area. Obviously, they have failed in doing so, but they're supposed to work closely with UN peacekeepers. The UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, is supposed to number some 10,000, and then several other thousand Lebanese armed forces are supposed to join together and control southern Lebanon. That was the result of the 2006 war, the agreement that was supposed to be implemented. Of course, what we've seen here is Hezbollah has great control over those areas in southern Lebanon closest to the border. What's very concerning is hearing through Lebanese channels that potentially the LAF was firing back today. And this is, of course, a major concern. You don't want to see Israeli forces and Lebanese forces that are not Hezbollah directly confronting each other in the confusion on the ground. And you certainly don't want to see any instances where UN peacekeepers are potentially in the line of fire as well. From the latest I have from the UNIFIL spokesperson, he's told me that right now UNIFIL forces remain in southern Lebanon and that they have not changed their posture, which going forward, I would have to imagine as IDF forces continue to push deep inside Lebanese territory, that UN peacekeepers are either going to be working with the IDF and facilitating their movement in conjunction with the IDF, or they're going to pull out altogether.
Okay, it's important we keep track of these events, and hopefully we can keep in touch on that too, Zach. Now, what about the big question of the form of the coming counterstrike by Israel after the missile attack from Iran? What do we know? I mean, seems to be generally assumed that Israel will not contemplate hitting nuclear targets in Iran. We know Joe Biden, he said yesterday that he did not want to see that happen. And we also know, don't we, that the high-level folk from Washington are talking to the leadership of Israel too. They're talking in a way that they were not so recently, when there was a deep chill in the air.
You know, I'm seeing just a few moments ago, I think less than an hour old here, as President Biden was walking to Marine One on the White House lawn, responding to a reporter's question, saying that he did not believe that there's going to be any sort of retaliatory strike by Israel today. Although we're hearing that on this end, the Israeli side is certainly getting ready for some sort of retaliatory attack, but they don't feel any sense of urgency right now. One of the reasons why I'm down here in the Negev Desert, I'm near Netzarim Air Base in the south of Israel, where we have new satellite images today that yesterday there was a cloud cover that partially obscured the base as the satellites were making their pass, but today it was clear. We do see damage to the base itself. We see a hangar that appears to have suffered from a fairly large hit. We don't know at this point if the ballistics themselves were able to get through Israeli air defenses and inflict direct hits, or if this is bits of raining debris as they were being intercepted. But the way the Israeli air defense system works, it's supposed to be intercepting these things before they get anywhere close to any of these strategic targets. Yeah. So the fact that we have satellite passes now that are showing damage, we have at least 4 hits, sizable craters or big chunks of damage to buildings at this airbase that's about 10, 20 miles behind me. We're not allowed to, obviously, to get anywhere close to this base right now. But it does show that we're seeing the ability from Iran to be able to hit some of these military targets on the Israeli side. And I have been told that there has been some considerable shuffling of Israeli air assets, their fighter jets, their aerial refuelers, and that at the time of the attack, essentially they had their entire air force deployed. So if there was any hits on these bases, that they wouldn't be hitting parked jets on the ground. So it's something that we're waiting to see. Did this have any real deep hit on the Israeli Air Force here to be able to respond, potentially, hitting a couple of runways? I've noted that as we're watching these jets come in, we've spent a lot of time around these bases. Usually the jets come in on a certain pattern towards the runway. Yesterday, we watched as a couple of these jets had their spoilers deployed and were performing short landings on the runway. I don't think there was damage to the runway, but I think that right now these fighter pilots are practicing for short landings on potentially future damaged runways, which I thought was interesting.
Now, it may not be I'm guessing it's not possible to be really clear about this, Zach, for obvious reasons. But when Israel strikes back, if they're not going to be striking nuclear targets, what about oil installations in Iran? Because that would have a disruptive effect on oil markets. It would have an impact on, around the world, including in America, where there's an election coming. It would arguably hurt Joe Biden politically. Do you imagine that's part of the conversation? And would it even be a constraint on Israel?
All of the former IDF spokespeople that were called into active duty on October 7th last year and have since left active duty, so they have more freedom to post and say what they want. Three of the main guys who were there at the center of the attention, back on October 7th, they've been posting pictures of Iran's strategic oil facilities and the port, one of their major oil ports, refineries. And one of them posted a picture and said, "Before?" ? I think this is the direction that Israel is going right now, that potentially they won't target these nuclear sites. One of the things I thought came to my head immediately was, if they're hitting Iranian nuclear sites, potentially that's good for Ukraine, because Iran's been scrambling, their nuclear programs scuttled in a way. But I texted some of my Ukraine sources and they say, actually, no, we don't want to see Israel hit any of these nuclear sites, because then potentially that in the context of the global landscape that we're in, potentially then Putin no longer has that red line to cross and says, well, Israel is hitting nuclear sites, nuclear targets, so can I. And then these nuclear power plants in Ukraine become a target as well. I just thought that was an interesting element here. Right now, what it seems like on the Israeli side is that they're tending towards these oil refineries, these oil targets, not the nuclear sites.
All right. As always, good to catch up, Zach. Thank you so much. Zach Anders there, live from the Negev Desert. Now, let's look at things on the Iranian side of this debate. Nega Mortazavi, Iranian-American journalist, political analyst, host of the Iran podcast, is with us now live on the line. Hello to you, Nega.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you, and welcome back to the program. Look, our assumption now is this fair and correct, is that Iran does want to contain the conflict as far as possible, because it prefers to act aggressively through its proxies, and it understands its own vulnerability if we get to the stage of all-out war.
Yes, I think the all-out war, especially direct conflict with Israel and more importantly with the US, is something that Iran has been trying to avoid since the beginning. And I think they've been consistent both in their messaging and in their action that this is something they don't want to engage in. At the same time, I think what we saw with this warning shot, as they frame it, and also passed in the previous one in April, is that at some stages they feel like if they don't act or if they don't hit back, they're just going to get hit harder. And this was one of their moments. Yeah. They didn't retaliate for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and then came the assassination of the Hezbollah leader and Iranian commander in Beirut. And essentially the thinking in Tehran seems to be that we need to do something in order to reestablish some deterrence. At the same time, we hear the Iranian president and officials messaging that they want to contain it, at least keep it to status quo and not escalate.
Right. Now, It's also fair, isn't it, to conclude that Iran's power to escalate the conflict on its side is now being limited by the way that Hezbollah has been weakened by Israel's strikes on its command structure, on its weapons supplies, and also by what we saw earlier this week when Israel had such success in neutralizing that missile barrage.
That's correct. I mean, we shouldn't forget, and this is certainly something that Iranians know all along, and one of the core reasons for the whole entire regional posture is that they're the underdog in this. Iran and all of its allies, the so-called axis of resistance, together combined cannot match the level of that weaponry and the resources that the Israeli side, with support of the United States, has. But at the same time, we've seen time and again, and especially in two devastating wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, that being the underdog doesn't mean that you can't create headaches and cause a lot of pain to the other side, especially if you're a local movement, if you're in your own country, if you're fighting in your mountains like the Taliban did, if you're fighting in your own corners in Iraq, and then things can spiral out of control and new problems because when the two forces are fighting on the ground in this situation. So I would say it's something that the Iranians have in their mind when they threaten that if escalation comes, they're willing to also engage more. But then at the same time, for the first reason that we both discussed, they want to contain it and at least keep it as status quo. At the same time, at least the diplomatic side of the Iranian political structure keeps asking and pushing for that ceasefire in Gaza.
Nega, thanks so much for joining us. Nega Mortazavi there, from the host of the Iran podcast.